good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying. We are aware that this is the last conversation before the cocktail. I ask permission to speak in Spanish to describe the scenario, and then we are going to continue in English. Paulo Roca today clearly described the challenges and opportunities, and he ended by discussing the leveling the playing field in order to compete in every sense of the word, mostly in the environmental area, and that is the point in this discussion on this panel. And we have taken that same description, we are going to look into it in this panel, and we are going to look at the data, the importance of having reliable data to carry forward strategies and communicate to our markets and communicate to our regulatory authorities, etc. So,
I'm sorry for that, to English. I described the importance of data, and data comes from a selection of certain methodologies, certain accounting. And in this respect, I would like Åsa and then Violeta to describe what is worldsteel and World Trade Organization are working on this in this regard. Please, Åsa, start with.
Well, thank you very much, José. It's my pleasure to be here with you. Actually, again, last time I was online. For those of you who attended in 2021, you might have seen my presentation. Yes, this is a very topical issue, in fact, of methodologies. It's a key priority of World Steel and of World Steel's members to try to align the different methodologies that are out there for greenhouse gas accounting for the steel industry. There are many, many, many different ways of accounting for many different reasons, which are very valid. Sometimes you want to know the carbon footprint of a product. Sometimes you want to know the footprint of a company as such, or you're reporting to your government, for example. But we need to make sure that these methodologies do not develop in sort of going away from each other, but that we are aligning as far as possible to ensure that it's easier to report, to make sure that we can compare and understand and have a similar understanding of things. And in this spirit, there is a new initiative. I'm not sure if that slide is visible to the audience.
Or yes. Is it shared there? Not yet. There it is.
Okay, it's coming now. All right. So the Steel Standards Principles is an initiative that is trying to do just that, to align on methodologies for the steel sector. And it is an initiative that we launched last year at the UN Climate Conference in Dubai in November, so almost a year ago. There were a number of different initiatives trying to or saw the importance of aligning. And so we were 6 organizations that came together to develop these principles. It was World Steel, it was the WTO, the International Energy Agency, the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative, which is a governmental initiative looking at public procurement, the Steel Breakthrough, which is another government-led organization or initiative, and the Responsible Steel.
You mentioned Alacero, right?
No, not from the beginning,
okay.
Not yet. But so these 6 organizations developed the principles, and the principles really, it's a high level talking about the necessity of really aligning methodologies so that we know what we're really talking about. And where it's not possible to align, to make sure that we can reach interoperability. So even if the methodologies are not exactly the same, that we can understand and compare them with each other. Or as a second step to have recognition of different methodologies. So this slide now shows you all the current signatories, because we launched at a COP last year with a number of organizations, including Alacero. But since then, the signatories and the support has grown for this initiative, which we think is really good. And you will recognize logos on here from intergovernmental organizations, for example, the OECD, but also steel companies, associations, but also some actors in the supply chain. So this is really a good initiative that we're now working on trying to align, but we're coming to that, I think.
Right. So, Violet, what's World Trade Organization playing, what role it's playing in these principles?
I mean, first to thank you, Jose, and thank you for the organizers. It's a pleasure to be here. I work, as you know, for the World Trade Organization. I'll make it clear for the Secretariat, which is the Secretariat that services around 166 members, governments from all over the world. They comprise 98% of global trade and GDP. And just the question that you asked me, I also got friends before coming here asking me, why are you going to a steel conference? And I have to say that over 2 years ago, I didn't know who Åsa was. Now we communicate on a daily basis. I didn't know much about the World Steel Association, about Alacero. And today, it's been incredibly eye-opening to see how much trade has had such a strong presence in your summit. And there's concerns around tariffs, of course, there's geopolitics, there are trade policy measures that are affecting the globe, that are affecting your region. And that's precisely why the World Trade Organization Secretariat wanted to get involved. Our involvement in the steel standards principles really dates back to 2022. At that time, what we started to see is many of our members in different committees were starting to raise concerns that they were seeing that green standards across high energy intensive sectors were growing, and their industries were basically facing increased costs, concerns over increased reporting, measurements, and whatnot. And so we wanted to do something to help. And so we at the WTO have a very important agreement that's called the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement. It was negotiated a long time by our members, but it's an agreement that's very important because what it does is it helps our governments to really think about setting regulations and setting standards that won't create unnecessary barriers to trade. So we took our mandate with the TBT agreement and the responsibility of working with standard-setting organizations to convene, to bring World Steel Organization at that time and many other players from the industry and also in our international organizations to come to the WTO to tell us more about what they were facing, to understand more about why we had all these different standards growing and what that meant for trade. And for us, we did it in the spirit of trying to bring collaboration so that we can avoid unnecessary trade tensions and frictions down the road. So it was really a foresight exercise. As Åsa was saying, we got together with 5 other organizations to develop the real content and the let's say the guidance that's behind the principles. We have around 6 major elements that are really trying to encourage those endorsers to reach interoperability of standards and methodologies. We know that there will not be one standard set. We ourselves are not a standard-setting organization, of course, but we're trying to really build that collaboration so that there's at least more interoperability so that standards can coexist with each other, that they can achieve a certain level of mutual recognition, and they can help really, countries and industries navigate through that space. At the WTO, we're using our convening power. We have 166 members. We're trying to bring everyone together with the World Steel Organization. We're trying to build also as much knowledge and data so that our governments are as best informed as possible.
As you mentioned, Alacero signed as a signatory to these steel standards principles because we see that chaos or multiple alternatives doesn't help to give confidence to our customers, to our market, to our stakeholders. So we like you to work on behalf of World Steel's and Alacero members in trying to converge as much as possible it was 41. Can you comment on the mapping of the alternatives that you just surveyed?
Yeah. So I already mentioned that there are lots of different methodologies out there, but we didn't actually know how many or which ones were used, which ones were the most used ones, and also how similar they were. So we started a big mapping exercise about 6 months ago. When we started collecting first how many there were out there, we came up to a number around 80 different ones. And it doesn't mean that they are unique as such, but they have different variations between them. So we selected the 40 plus most used ones, and then we conducted a survey together with those creating those standards so that we make sure we have the best information of about, again, 40 different categories or aspects of it. And what we found is that, in fact, there are about there are lots of linkages between the different standards, and they are referring to each other or building on each other. And the 5 most commonly used ones are the 2 ones created by worldsteel, which is our life cycle assessment inventory and our CO2 data collection. And then the 2 ISO standards that have been developed based on those. And then the greenhouse gas protocol is a very important one as well. So that's actually quite a good starting point, I must say, that these relatively few standards are sort of the basis for everything. But then everyone has sort of added their own aspects to it. So, for example, they have different scopes. So some is for products, some for companies, as I mentioned, or sites. But that's not necessarily an issue. But we can still try to, there are different things that we can try to align to make comparison between these different standards easier. And what we've come up with is that we would benefit from having one common reporting point. So even if you are doing a carbon footprint for a product, if you could also make reports on the footprint of crude steel, you could do the same thing when you look at a site. You choose the emissions up to the crude steel, and you can do that within a company as well, and you would be able to compare in a different way or easier and see the differences between the different methodologies. It's also increasingly important not to have only CO2, but actually look at greenhouse gases in total, and we've heard John Lichtenstein was referring to that. Scope 3 emissions are, of course, in generally sort of getting more and more attention. And in steel, this in particular means that we need to look at the methane emissions from metallurgical coal mining and from natural gas. And it seems that these have been underreported before, not necessarily on purpose or from our mistake, but the measurements in the mines and so on have not, it seems, been accurate. So this is something that needs to be addressed.
So on top of eventually converging methodology, there are some external emission factors that will evolve during time, like John Lichtenstein mentioned, the CO2, the methane emitted from coal mining, for instance, no?
Yeah, so we learn all the time, right?
Yeah.
So all of us, we know the emissions from our own processes quite well now, but as we look in the supply chain, we get new information. So methane is one of those things that are going to change. And if we start reporting on that in a how can I say, more detailed or more accurate way going forward, that means that our reported emissions are going to go up. Even if it's not actually the emissions, as in we haven't increased the emissions, they were always there, they were just not reported before. So that's a challenge, of course, from a communication.
Back, Violeta, to the tradability attribute or characteristic of steel, and if I may, if steel is traded worldwide, it's been traded CO2 as well, because CO2 is embedded in a certain accounting rule on trade. So trade issues and CO2 or carbon footprint are intimate, linked together. So from a trade perspective, why World Trade Organization thinks that it's important to get a common ground or understanding in order to minimize this friction in trade that you mentioned already?
So maybe I can start off by sharing a little bit of statistics on how tradable is steel or international trade. And for that, I have to thank the World Steel Association, because they do have the best statistics. And you should know that there's around 402.8 million cubic meters, tons. Sorry, tons.
Million tons.
Of steel that is traded internationally. And it's no surprise that there are countries like China, like Japan, like South Korea, like Germany, the EU as a bloc that are some of the largest exporters of of steel. They are also some of the largest importers of steel, and there's a lot of intricacies to try to understand how that import and export relationship works. For us at the WTO, what's really important is to, our mandate is to ensure that trade is as fair, as transparent, and free, and operates as freely as possible. There isn't, to my knowledge, when it comes to trade now, there's not one way of looking at how to measure carbon emissions of products. And of course, trade in products and trade in goods is incredibly important in sort of today's economy. What is really where we kind of look at the emissions factors is along the interoperability of standards. So we know that, for example, as much as we can work and our members in setting international standards that can help to achieve a level of consistency and measurement and methodologies, the more it will be easier to kind of make those country comparisons. If you don't have the country comparisons, the product comparisons, across countries, then it would make it difficult to trade. You would be creating those unnecessary barriers to trade that we could see in regulations or you see in standards. It's not unique to steel. You face this across all types of products. And the biggest challenge that we have at the moment is because decarbonization standards across various sectors or sustainability standards are relatively new. They are growing. When I say relatively new, it's probably the last 10 years. A lot of them are still voluntary. There are many international standards now being adopted, of course, across different sectors. And then it's the responsibilities of countries to align their national schemes to those international standards as much as they can so that we can achieve a level of consistency. We are trying to monitor as many technologies as possible out there to see if there could be some, correct comparisons on trade emissions, but it's very difficult. And it would be, the mandate of our governments to really, pick some of those technologies and embed them in those different standards.
I'll come back to trade issues. I want to describe that from Alacero perspective, as a Latin American producer, we are very concerned about the EU CBAM, and acknowledging that you also are not European representative. I want you please to describe to the audience what CBAM means and is, and then link it with Violeta to the perspective for CBAMs, generally speaking, and why or what should be the conditions to have to be World Trade Organization compliant, okay? So please, Åsa, if you may describe.
I'll try to describe in very simple words. First of all, just to say that World Steel has no position on CBAM, as in we are not for or against. As you can imagine, we have members who are very upset with CBAM and those who like it a lot. But in principle, it starts with the emissions trading scheme in Europe. And as you might be aware that in Europe, you have to basically buy allowances for emitting greenhouse gases, CO2 in the steel industry. But because steel is such a trade-exposed sector, up till now, the European producers have gotten free allowances to a very large degree. Covering most of their production in Europe up to sort of a benchmark, but let's not go into the details. The idea is that as we need to decarbonize, or as Europe needs to decarbonize, and it is determined to do so, these free allowances need to be phased out. But as you phase them out, the cost of production in Europe, or the cost of emission in particular, will increase quite substantially. And then there is a risk of carbon leakage, as in that the European production or companies would not invest in Europe anymore, but invest in other parts of the world where the legislation is not so strict. And to try to avoid this, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms would then put, will make sure that imported products to Europe would pay the same cost as the domestic production. It's not going to happen overnight. CBAM was introduced about a year ago, and for now it's just a reporting obligation. But from January 2026, the allowances will start to phase out, which means that the cost of CBAM will start to be phased in. It again has a transition period. I believe it's until 2034, where the full cost of CBAM will be felt, and it starts with a very gradual phase-in and then goes faster. It's also important to know that if you are already paying a carbon price in the country of production, this cost can be deducted from the price of the CBAM certificates that you would have to buy otherwise.
Let me stop you right there, because this is precisely the key point where we see the risk of spillover of this CBAM. Eventually, we are not interested in shipping steel over there, but then, since the revenue expectation of the government or the regulators say, oh, if you want to ship 1 ton there and you're going to pay in euros, why not to establish a new carbon tax here or a cap and trade and keep those euros in the domestic country, in the origin of country. So this kind of dominoes effect or spillovers of CBAM, it's kind of the concern that we also have on top of having a redirection of steel that won't be entering because of competitiveness. China, Turkey, India won't be able to enter that market and will try to enter Latin American as they are doing right now. No? So this is the kind of concerns that we have. So back to Violeta, generally speaking, not on EU, what would be your thoughts about this kind of green shoring strategies to protect market and production, and what would be the suggestion to Latin American countries?
So this, I guess it was this morning that we heard a lot about nearshoring, friendshoring, regionalization, and I understand where you're coming from as a region in terms of seeing, the geopolitics and the challenges, and we were concerned a couple of years back on whether we would start to see an increasing trend across regions trying to build resilience in their supply chains by regionalizing. And what we believe is that could help in terms of building resilience, but it also can create other vulnerabilities down the line. It could create imbalances and inequities across countries, and ultimately we would see a world of regional fragmentation, and one that would undermine what WTO stands for and what WTO rules are about, which is really trying to create a level playing field, which is the topic of today's conversation. So I guess in terms of a regional outlook, and I was very inspired a couple of panels back looking at some of the panelists that spoke about the opportunities that Latin America can offer when it looks at its industry being more competitive, being more green, having lower carbon emissions. And it was John's maybe presentation that looked at Latin America doing relatively well compared to other regions in terms of being able to produce steel now, but maybe into the future that is more green. And sort of to encourage that, I think that outlook of trying to look at that green comparative advantage would be incredibly valuable. We believe in something called reglobalization. It's actually our Director General, Dr. Ngozi, who's a very strong advocate of kind of calling on global economies to not recede from trade, that really kind of look at embracing trade, but doing it in a new way that looks at more integration of countries, of developing countries in supply chains, and that also looks and takes into account more sustainability issues. So we're really hoping that countries, and many of the countries where you operate in terms of the steel industry in the region are, of course, members of the WTO.
Yeah, I'm going to address a personal opinion here on this regard. Back to the CBAM on specific, which is one of the 80 alternatives of accounting CO2 on steel. I just want to pick that Scope 2, it's not included on the final period. They are asking now for the carbon footprint of the energy matrix of Latin America, or the country where the steel is coming from, which is by far cleaner than the European, but then in the final rule, they're not going to include on the carbon footprint. So that competitive advantage we have in Latin America, as Martin Berardi mentioned in this morning, it's not a leverage to comply and to enter the market. Yeah. So it's kind of still unlevel playing field yet, and there's still a challenge to go.
Just a little comment on that, because the CBAM is related to the EU emissions trading scheme, as I mentioned from the beginning. And this is why the accounting rules are not, how can I say, they are not intuitive to those of us who are working on methodologies in the steel sector, because it's not what we would call a normal carbon footprint. Right. It excludes certain things because they are not covered in the EU ETS, or because they are treated as a separate sector, which is the case with electricity. Perfect. So it's a difficult methodology to understand and, to be honest, to accept, I think. Sure.
Yes.
Can I come in just on your question on the carbon border adjustment mechanism? Just to say, we know that there's a lot of attention to the EU CBAM, but it's really, I think, important to look at other CBAMs, that other border carbon adjustment mechanisms that are on the rise. And from the WTO, what we've tracked is we know that the UK is about to finalize their own BCA that would come into implementation in 2027. We are expecting also Canada, possibly Australia, and the US also has a few proposals for consideration from government. So we're only seeing that BCAs will increase, and for us a concern is that it's the chaos that you were talking about earlier, Jose, in terms of having too many different BCAs with different methodologies that will bring additional costs to industry. They will make compliance much more difficult and possibly exclude also smaller players or developing countries. So we're very worried, and we're really calling on also using the WTO as a forum, which we use right now, to really foster more dialogue and collaboration, so that maybe there's some alignment or some interoperability between those BCAs.
Great. I want to save the 5 minutes to go to address to another spiky subject, which most of the steel companies here have released some initiatives on mass balancing or chain of custody, which is the correct word. And I want to ask Åsa if you can describe what worldsteel is doing in this respect. It's important to level the initiative that we ask worldsteel to run.
All right, yeah, sure. I'll be happy to talk about that. So like Jose mentioned, there is of course an interest from the market to buy so-called green steel or low carbon steel, or well, whichever term you want to call it. And companies are responding to this, and a number of the companies, I believe, here in the room, but also around the world, have now these green steel offerings on the market. Some of them, or I would say even a majority of them, are based on the so-called mass balancing or chain of custody approach. And what does that mean? Because of course today we do not have one definition of what is green steel, right? So all of these companies have made up their own definitions and their own systems. But this idea of the chain of custody or mass balancing is that you calculate your carbon footprint for your product, and then when you make savings of greenhouse gases in your production, they are typically maybe on their own not significant enough to change that carbon footprint very much. Maybe it will change with a few percentages, but it's not really enough to be claiming that it's a green product. So instead of changing the carbon footprint, you keep those reductions that you've made, you put them in in a bank. And when a customer wants to buy a product from you with a lower carbon footprint, they buy the product and then they buy certificates from that you have then in the bank of the reductions that you've made before. So instead of the reductions being, let's say, evened out on all your production, you keep them and you allocate them to specific products. So that's the principle of it. Again, as I mentioned, there is no common methodology to do this today. Some other sectors are using it, but more for input material. We know, for example, in the chemical sector, they're doing this for recycled content or for bio-based input. But it's definitely on the rise. So with all these different methodologies, again, out there, we got a request at worldsteel from our executive committee to start working on developing a guidance on how it could be applied in the steel sector to try to,
narrow.
Bring them more in a narrower gap. So we've been working with the task force of our members on that, a truly global task force, and it's been a really interesting work understanding what the different companies are doing and what the important aspects are. And we issued our principles in April this year. They are available on our website. And since then, we have been working on the more detailed guidance. So it's not completely approved yet, but we're hoping to do that within the coming week or so and have them published again on our website.
Right.
But just as a final thing, this is in the very starting point of this overall discussion. So there are a few standards within ISO starting to be developed. So this is a way also for us to, let's say, consolidate our views together and see how we can then be able to put those views into the international standards process.
Okay, we are running out of time. I just want to thank you both because you're really running a challenge in gathering us and gaining consensus in such a controversial aspect with different interests, depending on the country, depending on the technology that we have to produce steel, the many issues all together, and it's very relevant, the work that you have been doing and the future challenges you're facing. We wish you good luck in trying to level up the accounting rules as the leveling playing field for the market of steel. So thank you very much, Åsa and Violeta.
Yes, can I just add to that it wouldn't be possible without your involvement. I mean everyone, and it's not just the steel companies, it's the associations, it's the stakeholders in the supply chain, and also the intergovernmental organizations, because we don't need to only agree, we also need to implement it, right?
Yeah, and just final comment, it was mentioned 2.6, it's the share of CO2 embedded on steel that it's produced in Latin America. It's really almost negligible. So, but we have a strong presence by being in every meeting, in technical meeting and strategical and political meeting. So I want to thank Alacero members also for being there every time. So again, thank you. Do you have a final comment?
Go ahead. Just one thing to add. We launched, as Åsa was saying, the steel standards principles at the last COP in Dubai, and we had 40 endorsers at that time. We are at 58, and they really include international organizations, industry associations, companies, standard-setting bodies. Alacero, of course, is a very, very active member. It doesn't exclude other organizations, companies that are, participating in the summit to join, and joining helps, helps you to be part of the discussions and be part of the response. So.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.